Okay, we are on. Hi, this is Michael Waitze, and welcome back to this month very, very amplified. As always, David Gritz, a co-founder and managing director of InsurTech New York, is with us. David, I'd ask you how you're doing, but I think we'll find out as we keep discussing this stuff. I think it's all Supreme Court all the time right now. This has been a pretty incredible, what are we here? We're in July, but I mean, it's been a pretty incredible term for the Supreme Court.
Absolutely.
I want to start with Chevron and end with Trump, but why don't we start with Chevron and you can run through that and also give the case names because I think it's important for people that are listening that may not have been following this as closely as you and I have. I want them to be able to go and do their own research. No, all kidding aside, this is all really important stuff, all three of these cases. Anyway, let's start with Chevron.
Yeah. So the case in question is Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raymondo. And essentially, the exact name of the case is not as important as the significance of what's changed. So it's essentially overturned a precedence of over 40 years. And maybe we'll take a separate tangent to talk about stare decisis, because I think that's a pretty important concept that the listeners should know about. So essentially, the gist of the previous precedent was that if you think about the organization of the government in the US, the idea is checks and balances. So you have an executive branch that has administrative agencies under it. You have Congress, which is the organization that passes the laws and supplies the money. And then you have the courts, which are the ones that are supposed to enforce the laws, and then they have jurisprudence over individual citizens if those laws are broken on a civil or criminal fashion. So essentially, in this situation with Chevron, originally the concept was, if Congress passes a law, the people in Congress don't have the time or the ability to specify every specific use case or example or instantiation of the law. So they said it with somewhat ambiguous terms, which is sometimes politically decided and politically motivated. Other times they just don't know. And information and data, which is not really their parlance, is added by the administrative agencies. So keep in mind here, the administrative agencies typically are part of the executive branch. So they are then, based off of the previous Chevron decision, given the ability to specify what is actually implemented within the law that's passed. So Congress gives the budget and the approval, and then the administrative agencies then implement it. So the Chevron precedents essentially said, hey, agencies, if we're too ambiguous, you have the right to specify this, and the courts generally will defer to you. That being said, there were some modifications on this Chevron precedents that the administrative agencies had the power, and that was over what's called the major decision threshold. So they could specify something that was minor or trivial or interpretive, but if it had a major economic or social impact, that would have to go back to Congress in order to get specified. It wasn't something they could decide, or it could be something that was interpreted by the courts. So this was giving more power to the executive branch in Congress and taking power away from the courts. What happened in our most recent decision of the Loper Bright Enterprises decision is that the courts essentially took that power back. And it was a split decision. I think it was either 5-4 or 6-3, and essentially said, no, actually, the courts have the right to interpret the laws, and they're taking that away from the administrative agencies. So, there's a few things that are happening in mechanics of this that, the listeners should be aware of. First is the courts taking, 40 years of laws that have built upon laws, which is this concept of stare decisis, which is the court defers to the previous versions of itself. So that way we can have stable laws that we build on. Because if the courts flip-flopped every single time, no one would be able to understand or predict the laws, and we would have a much weaker society because, if you can't understand what you're supposed to do and not do, then, how can you operate a business? How can you, perform work as a citizen of a sovereign nation? So it's with a lot of logic that stare decisis exists, and this was kind of overturning that. And, some people are saying it's politically motivated because when it first happened, a lot of people said, oh, conservatives are really happy with this rule because the administrative agencies at the time were part of, a Republican government, and they would essentially interpret things to their benefit. But what's happened is with anything in politics, things usually devolve to whatever is the most extreme allowed by those in power. So a lot of the environmental regulations have essentially come down to the fact that the administrative agencies can interpret them to be more extreme than what Congress may have passed, and then the conservatives are pretty upset. So now supposedly they're happy with this new decision because, anytime they're unhappy with an environmental rule, they can go to the courts and try and get that reinterpreted or changed or paused or something like that. And, a perfect example of this that's happening right now, unrelated to environmental, was, the administrative agencies that are related to education tried to specify Biden's initiative to change the way that student loans are repaid. So there's a plan called SAVE, which allows, lower income people to repay their student loans at a lower pace or get more of it subsidized. And there was a few court cases that came in and said, no, actually, they shouldn't have that much latitude. So this new Supreme Court decision may impact that case, which is now pending now, which may give the courts the power to decide whether, this administrative agency gives people the ability to pay their loans slower or not. So I covered a lot there. Maybe there's a couple pieces you want to digest, Michael.
So I want to talk about who's driving this on the conservative side, right? In other words, is this something, because it's a 40-year precedent. The Chevron versus natural resources, right, was a 1984 case, right? Determined by the Supreme Court, and we've been living under that precedent for that entire 4-decade period of time. But I feel like if the research that I've done is true, is that conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation have been trying since the day that case was actually decided to try to take away this power from the administrative state, which at some level has now been called the deep state, right? That all these bureaucrats, all these people that are unelected are now making extreme decisions. And I guess the question I would ask to you is, what is the purpose of this kind of 40-year, at least in this case, crusade against Chevron, which essentially says Congress doesn't have the resources to be able to make these decisions on an incident by incident basis. Let the agencies that were built for this, whether it's the Health and Human Services, whether it's the Education Agency, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency, all these agencies that were set up to do just this. Why are they so, like, first of all, two things. One, why have they been fighting this battle for so long? What's like the political reason and the benefit reason? And then how do we get back to a balance? Because I kind of agree with you in the sense that if you leave these things to their own volition, whether you're on the right or on the left, you're going to get to the most extreme version of like what people want. And I think most people in the United States are more center leaning, whether they're center left or center right. You're going to have to tell me this because I haven't lived there in 30 something years. How do you make sure that the administrative state is not so extreme as well? And maybe address this idea first of like, why has this battle been going on since day one? And then how do we get back to a balance that's like more fair and more in line with what like most of the citizens that want?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, like one of the first pieces in that battle was the case law that came around on the major question, which arguably is probably one of the fairest balances and why we might not have even needed this case one way or another. If anything, we should have kept our previous Chevron decision because ultimately, we set a threshold. We said, if there was a major question that was interpreted, then it would have to go back to Congress. But to address your political point about should the courts or the administrative state have ability to make the decision, and why do conservatives want one way or another? So first is in actually both instances, neither party, well, depending on the level, right? Because some of the judicial branch is elected, but on the federal level, they're appointed, right? So if judges are making a decision on a federal level, that means that someone who's appointed is making a decision on the administrative agencies side. Similarly, they are appointed. I mean, in some of the cases, Senate has to approve them, so they're kind of indirect. So you have one non-elected body versus another, but I think ultimately the difference on each side is on the executive branch, it's supposed to be political, right? Like it's elected at the top level, and most of the thinking is that the administration under the top level generally follows their line of thinking. So that means we're going to have a lot of volatility in terms of our regulations, and that's what we see between administrations. The agencies change, and how the laws are enforced changes substantially, especially around balance between environmental protection and businesses being able to have the freedom to operate however they want.
Right.
So why conservatives probably would prefer the administrative state over the judicial side, which is not supposed to be a politicized organization, is just supposed to interpret what Congress wants, is because their whole thinking is that, if the judicial branch truly is interpreting what Congress wants, right? So, the law is passed and then the judges enforce what Congress wants, then likely whatever is passed is going to be limited to whatever is passed. If it's the executive branch and they're interpreting and changing the rules in the administration, then you can think about the layers and paperwork and additional ways that things can be enforced. And I'll give a perfect example, right? So let's just say Congress decided that they were going to allocate budget for new energy resources, right? And it was very ambiguous of how those energy resources could be used. So it could go to nuclear power, it could go to new oil pipelines from Canada, or it could go to wind and solar. Now, let's just say you have a liberal administrative state that interprets that and says, actually, our belief is that the interpretation from Congress, given all the things that are happening in climate today, is that the majority or a certain proportion or, rules around it should be based on this has to be clean, green, or renewable energy, or, we cannot create pipelines out of this, or we believe that nuclear power is not clean enough to meet the standards, right? And in this situation, if it was, post Chevron, so our current kind of judicial precedent, then the court could come in and say, well, actually, this was not something that Congress intended interpreting the laws as they are, is that it was any use of power, right? It wasn't supposed to be specified under these additional limitations. And in this case,
Right.
like conservatives would win from their perspective because it's all new power. It's not specifically limited. That being said, I'm not trying to make the point that conservatives are, anti EPA or against clean energy or green energy. But generally speaking, in the US, the Conservative Party seems to side more with oil and gas industries and heavy manufacturing. And it
And
tends to
why is
be
that?
so, I mean, if you think about historically where the places in the country are that are conservative or Republican, they happen to
Yep.
be in natural resource heavy places, right? Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma. All of these places have a substantial amount of natural resources, and they have industries and businesses that want to extract those natural resources out of the earth. Most of the liberal places in the US, think, Northern California, New York City, even Austin, are more service oriented economies where people, do work in offices. They don't use natural resources. So it doesn't affect the way that they make money as much, and they can be more focused on, more, I would say, good for the planet types of things without having, personal impact of that.
Yeah. Is there an argument to be made, though, David, from someone afar, like I am, to say that the natural resource based companies who are making record profits actually have the ability to invest in renewable resources and then dominate those industries as well if they really try. Like, where does the laziness come from so that they don't actually start to do this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the laziness just comes with the existing assets that they already own, right? So, like, if you already own, thousands of oil wells and freights that move oil from onshore to offshore and pipelines, then it's easier to just like optimize that infrastructure. That being said, it could be easily repurposed, right? Like, those pipelines could also carry clean hydrogen. Those same fracking technologies could be used for geothermal. So I think this just literally comes down to the owners just staying stagnant in their ways, even though like most of the infrastructure could be repurposed and they absolutely could win. Like if they wanted to take a big chunk of their record profits and buy solar panels that are very cheap now and compared to like all history, they could definitely do that. So, this is just purely kind of resting on their laurels, so to speak, opposed to, doing the hard work and innovating.
It feels lazy to me. I mean, and it must be weird for you, like a guy who's basically spent his whole career building innovation development programs to look at these things and just say, it's just lazy to me. Like that's what it feels like to me. I don't know. Um, I want to move on the Supreme Court because I kind of want to make a case, at least as we go on through this homeless case, right? So, can you talk a little bit about this one as well? Because this is actually kind of interesting too.
Yeah, so this was another case that was overturned. The case name is Johnson versus City of Grants Pass, which is actually a city in the state of Oregon. And essentially, the gist of the case is they overturned a previous Ninth Circuit decision. And for those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Legal system, circuits are basically subsets of the federal court system. The Ninth Circuit mainly represents Western states. I think it also includes Alaska and Hawaii. So obviously, it would include the state of Oregon. And the previous decision that was overturned was, based off of a case where there was a homeless encampment that had a number of people that were fined for living in the homeless encampment in a specific city. And the original decision said, actually, you can't be fined for living in a homeless encampment if there are no other places that a city can provide for you to live. And this was interpreted under, I believe, the Eighth Amendment, which is prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So the Johnson versus City of Grants Pass decision ultimately overturned that and said, cities can enforce the laws. If you are staying in a park and you're not allowed to sleep there overnight, or sleeping in a car in a certain place where you're not supposed to be, then they can create fines and ultimately put people in jail for violating the laws that they have. And, I can totally understand the controversy on both sides, especially since, my in laws live in Washington State, pretty close to Portland. I've been in Portland. I've seen the homeless tent encampments. And yes, it is a major problem. I think a lot of it stems from, drug addiction and arguably not enforcement of the laws around drugs. But I think that's not necessarily specifically germane to this specific decision. But I think what's important about this decision is what's happening in a lot of the cities in the western states in the US. So Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, where essentially, their streets are filled with homeless people that is ultimately impending business districts. So what it's doing is it's preventing people from wanting to be in certain areas of a city, wanting to conduct business, and it's destroying real estate values and ultimately harming the economic viability of the cities. Do I believe like we should cart off all the homeless people and put them into, farms or something like that? No. But I think there has to be a balance, right? Ultimately, if there's rules of law that protect the interests of people that have the right and have invested in the city to have a business, a retail store, a restaurant, they should be able to have a clean environment outside of them in the limits of the city. That being said, I think solving the homeless problem is a lot more complex, but frankly, the easiest way that all of these cities can solve the homeless problem is to change their zoning rules. The majority of zoning across almost all of the United States, like I think it's more than 80% of the United States, is single family homes. So that means
Right.
that cities like Portland, San Francisco, and Seattle are
Phoenix.
Phoenix are extremely expensive relative to people's income. So even if you're working minimum wage and getting, 15, 16, $17 an hour in Seattle or San Francisco, 30,000 or even 40,000 a year is not enough to afford a $3,000 to $4,000 a month apartment. But the only
Right.
way to solve that problem is to
Multifamily housing.
increase the supply of housing. There's no reason why we can't have more high rises. We can also, one of the biggest problems, which are also insurance related, that most of the world has solved, the US hasn't, is in almost all US cities, they require two independent fire escapes, which means that you're substantially limiting the type of buildings that can be built, because almost 30% of the building has to be designated to fire escapes. If you just allowed them to have one fire escape and then enforced zoning around what the building materials were, then you could have the same fire protection. There's not more internal building fires in the US than there are in Berlin or in Tokyo,
Right.
where ultimately they have more lax fire escape rules. So, it may seem out of the box, but the solution to the homeless problem is more homes. And it doesn't have to be for the homeless directly. It just has to be more homes in general to drive down the costs.
Is this another one of these examples? We've talked about this a bunch of times on this show, but is this another one of these examples of this is just like late stage capitalism, right? Kind of gets back to the pipeline stuff and the natural resources thing you were talking about. The people that own those things that don't want to change just want to optimize for what they already have, right? Look, my grandmother, my mom's mom, owned a multifamily house, right? I grew up like right outside of Philadelphia as well. There were row houses everywhere in Philadelphia. Nobody seemed to be too bothered by it, right? And
Yeah.
those things could be more affordable. I just don't remember there being that much homelessness. Why is it so hard to address this problem? Or is it just the fact that hedge funds now own homes and want to like optimize for stuff? Like what's going on? Again, I don't live there, so I don't know.
So, sure, I think arguably it could be part of late stage capitalism, but I think there is a more insidious part of it that people are not really thinking about, which is, post World War II, people
Yep.
fought in a war together and they had this concept of, being part of a community, right? And, the idea of being in a civilization means that you cared about civics, right? Like you cared about the neighborhood you were in, you cared about the city you were in, you cared about the community, you volunteered, and there was time and energy put to that. And when you have an environment where people were more community driven versus purely individualistic, then we think about things that impact not just the house you live in, the neighborhood you're at, but the community that you're a part of. And when you
Right.
think about things as a whole for what's the benefit of the community, then that means there's a trade off with you as an individual, right? And in most of these towns and municipalities where, there's a board of, we'll call it 4 to 10 elected people that are homeowners in that area, they don't represent the entire citizenry. If anything, most of them are semi-retired or retired people that own nearly the most expensive or more expensive homes in that area. So they're almost never going to pass rules and regulations that will go against their personal self-interest of keeping their home values down. If, more renters were on these boards or municipal governing bodies, then they would advocate for it. And if we cared more about civics and we cared more about our community like we did in the past, then ultimately it would be really easy to solve these. Like you can solve these problems with simply a few decisions. And there are some groups that have formed in California called the YIMBYs, Yes in My Backyard, that want to approve these things, and they go to the city councils and they try and do it, but they do it in a radical way. The right way to do it is grassroots, door knocking, people to people, belly to belly, friends to friends, communities to communities. And I think if people said, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice, 20% increase in the value of my house in order to have a safer community with less homeless and less crime, then
Yeah.
together we would have the best outcome for everyone. But there's just too much individualism in our society right now that we're promoting, we'll call it the champion of the self-made founder who did everything on his own and doesn't need to give to charity or care about anyone else as long as he enriched the venture capitalists. And there is something to be said about that, adding value to the world, but that value also has to be shared with the community, and people have to make some reasonable sacrifices.
Yeah, and to be fair, if you're afraid to go outside of your gated community to just go buy some milk, then what was the point of making all that money and adding all that value and having all that innovation? I think it's a bit of a myth, to be fair. I want to talk about this civics crisis, right? Because it was one of the notes that I made actually as you were talking earlier. Civics more than just because I think it's a good segue into the last topic that we wanted to discuss on this show. I feel like there's a crisis of civics in the United States, and I don't mean just like how do I get along with my neighbor. It's more like, do I even understand how and why my government works the way it does? I remember when I was a kid having a class in civics. Like, I think I could still tell you like the three branches of government, what they mean, how they work, and how they interact with each other, and also this idea of checks and balances. And I bet if you went to, like, I don't know, pick a number, 75% of the people, they wouldn't even know the difference between the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. Like, why do we have a crisis of civics right now? And I'm not talking about this idea of I'm just self-interested. I don't care what my community's like. I'm just talking about, like, how does my government work? And do I really want to live in a representative democracy, or do I just want to live in like a in a dictatorship? Because it doesn't seem to make much of a difference to me, kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, Michael, came from our push in the opposite direction. So the US has had a huge push on STEM, right? So science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEAM. I think they include art, but usually it's just STEM. And if you think about it, if you have a group of K through 12 students and they have a limited amount of time that they can be taught things, right?
Yep.
Let's just call it 6 hours a day minus, like, recess and lunch and
Lunch and
moving
recess.
around,
Yeah.
right? So if they have 6 hours a day and you're saying, 4 or 5 of it needs to go to science, technology, and math, and maybe, an hour for reading, or, some other open-ended thing that they want to do, then it's taking away from the ability to learn about civics and learn about history and learn about language, right? And the challenge is, sure, it is really great for people to work on STEM, and we definitely need more of that, but we also need more electricians. We need more politicians, right? I mean, if you think about what's happening in the US right now, we've probably had a greater precedence in this election of never both than we've ever had, right? There's so many
Double
people
haters.
that are double haters, right? And the reason why we have so much never both is because we're not building a pipeline of talented politicians that really believe and want to support their country.
I have to tell you something. Again, I've lived overseas for 30 something years. If you had told me that the combined age of the two presidential candidates was going to be over 150, almost 160, I would have laughed at you. And you're right. Like, why are those the only two viable or best candidates?
Why do our Gen Z, why are they more interested in being social media influencers than actual real influencers in their community? If they put all the energy they put to build their TikTok audience, to build a real in-person human audience, they could be mayors of their towns. They could be heads of their city councils. They could be on administrative boards that make real impact in the real world. And I think, we if we develop all the way from the beginning, from first grade, that it's important that we spend time on these things. And maybe, it's okay if they don't learn how to do, calculus 3 by the time that they graduate high school. I don't think, at least for me, and to be fair, I'm an industrial engineer, so like probably 60% of my college degree was all advanced esoteric math, right? So I definitely could have taken one less math class in high school and a class on, European history. And I feel like I would have been a much better person. If anything, it would probably help me more as a venture capitalist to be a little bit worse at statistics and a little bit better at understanding European history and culture. So, when I look at a startup that's in the UK and then, they have a development team in Poland, I have a better understanding of what that actually means than, if I could finish reviewing their financial projections, like, simulation model or their Monte Carlo in like 10 minutes
In your
faster.
head. Yeah. And here's the other thing. I want to push back a little bit on this idea of just because you're taking STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math, you can't take a civics class. I took AP English, I took AP chemistry, and I took AP calculus. And I still know how a bill makes its way through Congress. Okay.
It's
Like,
true.
I just
It's
don't think I
definitely
just don't think it's
true.
enough. I did both.
Yeah, no, but I think the whole point is like a lot of the school systems now are saying only STEM matters. They're not
No way.
counting anything else. Yeah.
Here's the thing, though, David. If you don't understand European history or American history or Asian history, then you can't understand so many other things. Like, then you, of course, you wouldn't support NATO. Like, really simple stuff like this. You wouldn't support NATO because you wouldn't even understand why it's there. Like, I bet if you asked a lot of people, like, what NATO even stands for, and I don't mean the reason why it exists, but just like what the acronym is for, most people wouldn't even know. It scares the bejesus out of me, to be fair. Anyway,
I when I spent my own time to learn about how the ENIAC worked, I think that gave me a lot more appreciation for large language models and what
for
some of
sure.
our, formative technologies are. So understanding the history of computing helps
Yeah.
you understand where we are today.
Absolutely, because otherwise you just think like large language models and artificial intelligence were invented like last week, and they were all invented by Sam Altman. None of which is true. Oh, sorry, frustrating. Anyway, talk to me about the last case we're going to mention, which is the Trump versus the United States of America. Or is it U.S. versus Trump? I can't remember which way it
Trump
goes.
versus US. Yeah. So essentially, this case was about it's actually an appeal derivative of one of Trump's
The
existing
DC case.
cases, but essentially it was a question about whether he should have immunity for acts performed while he was president. And essentially, this was building on previous precedent over two other cases. One which was Nixon versus Fitzgerald, and the other was Clinton
Yep.
versus Jones. And the Nixon case basically was the first case where the Supreme Court had to decide essentially what are the bounds of immunity. And then the Clinton case, yeah,
Can we say this though? Can we say this? The Nixon versus Fitzgerald was a was a civil case, not a criminal case, right? So very, very different. It was a civil
absolutely. And
case.
well, and so was
Yeah.
Clinton. They were both.
And so was Clinton versus Jones, right? So this is very, very different. So using those things as equivalents in and of themselves is tricky to begin with, right? Because one's a criminal case and the other two are civil cases. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So ultimately, the decision in the Trump case was that, Trump does not have absolute immunity over anything that he does, but, he has immunity over official acts, which, depending on how you look at this, it is a potential dangerous precedent to say, a president can determine something as an official act, or a judge can determine as something as an official act, and then now he's immune from it. That being said,
But also
ultimately,
the way the also David, the way the evidence can be used. In other words, if you do something as president and that evidence leads to a potential criminal case that you've done personally, apparently that evidence is not admissible. So then,
generally speaking, this is giving, presidents of the United States significantly more power while they are in office. That being said, I think there are definitely two perspectives on this, right? So one is, people should be concerned about the presidents they choose and what they can do now with this, declared immunity. On the other side, just to play devil's advocate, right? I think it's almost half or more than half of the 192 countries in the world are either a monarchy, a dictatorship, or something where essentially equivalent of the executive branch has substantially more power and less checks and balances than traditional democracies.
Yeah, but that's not good enough, no? I
No,
mean,
why?
so
That
what?
was the start of the point, right? I didn't
Yeah,
get to
sorry,
the
go
point.
ahead.
So the
Yeah,
point
go
is
ahead.
that, ultimately, if you look at history, democracy is roughly an experiment that started about 400 to 500 years ago. And it is a still experimental form of governing, and it's effective, right? We've seen so much economic growth. We've seen a lot of people raised out of poverty more than almost ever in human history, and we've seen the rise of this concept of freedom. But what we've also seen is, substantial major wars in the same type of wars that we've had, in monarchy type of world. And we've seen a lot of volatility, right? Like all of these governments change every 4 to 12 years of the makeup of them, and they change how they create laws and govern society, which you can argue is good. But if you look like all the way in the history of time, you know, there is something to be said about having a monarch that's going to be in for 50, or their family's going to be in for 100 years, that is going to set the precedence of how to transform a country or an economy. And if you look in China, like the transformation that they've had in terms of improving their economy, shifting to green energy recently, building cities, having transportation, all that's happened because they've had a command and control economy that could not happen in the same way of democracy. So am I saying they're morally equivalent? Absolutely not. Like, granting someone immunity for criminal actions that they did in their ruling time is a pretty dangerous precedent. That being said, I think acknowledging the fact that monarchies or governing bodies that are similar to them can be less volatile and more effective is something we should just be aware of. And frankly, some people prefer to be governed by dictatorships. That's not me, but we have to acknowledge that society might prefer that in some sense, and some people just like being the sheep. So if that's you, like, maybe this is a great thing and you should be pretty excited. But otherwise, I think we should be, somewhat fearful, because the whole point of democracy is the rulers and the police should fear the citizens, not the other way around. And this is one step closer to us, fearing the people that rule us.
Yeah, we're also at a tipping point in the United States. We're running into this idea of minority rule. And I don't think that if you look around the world in places where there's been minority rule, whether monarchy or dictatorship or benign dictatorship, that it's ever really worked really well, particularly for the people that weren't in that particular minority. You can see that in South Africa, you can see it in China with the Uyghurs, you can see it all over the world. And for those of us that are part of a very, very, very small group of people, you really run the risk that, and you've seen this happen already in the US over the past like 8 years, you really run the risk that if there's immunity for this, that, and the other thing, well, then that immunity can then bleed into other groups of people, right? It's not just the immunity that's granted to the leadership. Yeah,
The stability of a government is highly dependent on the social contract with its citizens, right? So if the
absolutely.
citizens don't believe that social contract is fair, like going back to history, why it's important to know your European history is like we're running back into the French Revolution again. So
Yep. Yep. Let them eat
ultimately,
cake.
it's important to have that social contract. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are, whether you're Bill Gates or Elon Musk. If the majority of citizens don't believe there's an equal social contract, that wealth is absolutely worthless.
It's completely worthless. And you bring up a really good point. The French Revolution is probably the seminal point around this, is that if you take away rights from enough people, at some point they just won't put up with it. And again, you make a really great point. The police and the government should be afraid of its citizens, not vice versa. And that's exactly what happened in the French Revolution, because the people kind of got together where they were like, this is a little too much. And they revolted. And it's the same thing. And I really feel like that the cycles are a lot faster today. So you can get whatever kind of dictatorship or fascism you want in the United States. It's probably not going to last that long, but it's going to be really ugly while it's going on. And I don't think that these decisions in these Supreme Court cases, whether it's Johnson versus the city of Grants Pass, whether it's Trump versus the US, or whether it's the reversion of Chevron, I don't think trying to go back to things that existed 40 years ago just because you think it was better back then is a way to make sure that social contract is strong enough. And I think people are just going to get pushed in a way that maybe in 7 to 10 years from now, you're going to find out that there's going to be another revolution.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
guess we'll have
just
to see.
generally from my perspective, I feel like we're moving towards economically a society that is not supporting the lower classes. And if
Too
anything,
bifurcated.
we need to do whatever we can socially and politically to make up for that economic change. We're basically going back to the 1920s era where,
Yeah.
industrialists own the world. The difference is
The robber
instead
barons.
of replacing Vanderbilts, and
Rockefellers
now we're
and the
replacing
Carnegies.
them with Bezos and Musks, right? Like the new industrials are the corporate tech giants and the people that started them. And it's even worse because in the case with the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, and the Fords, they employed thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. To be fair, Amazon does employ hundreds of thousands of people, but they don't have to, right? They can move to a purely robotic way where they can eliminate probably a quarter of their jobs.
Yeah, I'm not so worried. We can spend another entire podcast talking about technology replacing humans, because I think that over the large arc of history, like it's just happened so many times, and humans find a way to create other jobs. But here's the thing, is that the concentration of power today and the bifurcation of wealth today, you're right, is probably worse than it was in the 1920s. And the amount of power that those people have today is different than it was back then. But also the government and the way the government reacted to that, right? And these sort of monopolistic practices that the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Mellons had, they broke those things up, right? That was the thing with Standard
Exactly.
Oil. They
It
broke
was
that stuff up,
the
right?
chief, trust breakers where, we break up all the corporation, even recent history with AT&T,
Yeah.
The Baby Bell system all being broken up. So, yeah, I think, but that's my point. Ultimately, it's the job of the government to balance out the economic cycles, right? So if the economic cycle concentrates wealth to the capital side, the producers, then the government needs to create balance through the mechanisms that it has, whether it's things that you talk about, housing, zoning, creating a social contract so people feel like what they have is fair. All those things are important in order to maintain some form of order. And one thing I'm really optimistic on is AI has the ability to actually help rise up social classes. So if you look at most previous technologies, whether it's robotics, Internet of Things, RPA, they all help the people that had the most technical knowledge. AI actually helps people that have the least knowledge to be as productive as people with more knowledge. So I think if anything, AI has the best chance of restoring our economic and social contract. So I'll leave with that optimistic note.
Okay, let's leave it there. David Gritz, a co-founder, managing director of InsurTech New York. I always say these are my favorite discussions. Let's do more, man. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.